99% of chess players look at the board and ask, what should I do here? And that's the wrong question. The top 1%, they ask something completely different. See, they follow two rules from Capablanca. Rules so simple, you're going to wonder why nobody told you this before. And by the end of this video, you'll have a way of thinking about chess that most players will never have. So yeah, no messing around. I'm Philip. Let's jump right in. In this position, my opponent went bishop to e2, improving the bishop, and I answered with h5, gaining space on the king side. Now notice that we castled on opposite sides, so it's very natural to start pushing pawns and launch a pawn storm against the opposing king. Then he goes a4, looking to play a5, and keep pushing forward to try to expose my king. And since earlier in the game I had already lost the pawn on a7, if he manages to carry out that plan, he's going to get two open files to come after my king. So the natural question here is, what should we do? What should we be looking for? That's where the first fundamental principle comes in. And before I explain it, I want to mention something. In Capablanca's book, Chess Fundamentals, somewhere around chapter 7, if I'm not mistaken, he says something that applies perfectly to what we're saying here. I don't remember the exact wording, but the idea is basically this. Having a threat is always an advantage, but you don't necessarily have to execute that threat right away. Just keeping the threat hanging already forces your opponent to worry about it, to tie pieces down to defense, and because of that, they might miss or simply fail to stop a shot somewhere else on the board. That's Capablanca talking, and that idea is exactly what I want you to keep in mind from now on. Every time you're analyzing your candidate moves or trying to understand what your opponent wants, the starting point should always be to look for moves that create concrete threats. The side creating threats is the one dictating the pace of the game because the opponent is forced to react instead of carrying out their own plan, and that's what gives you the initiative. It doesn't matter whether your style is more tactical or more strategic, the first step in any position is always to see if there are immediate threats available. So when my opponent played a4, that's exactly what I did. I looked at the position and asked, do I have any move that threatens mate? Clearly not in this position, but that question always has to be asked. Another question is, do I have any move that threatens a piece or maybe leads to a trade that favors me in material or activity? Those are the kinds of moves that create immediate pressure, and that's always where you start when evaluating a position. So let's take a look at this position. Is there any move along those lines? If you look closely, none of the black pieces can create an immediate threat here. The only move that seems to do that, actually threatening a piece, would be f3. But after the exchanges, it's not really clear what we gain by sacrificing that pawn because the resulting position doesn't offer any obvious compensation. Still, these are exactly the kinds of moves you should consider because looking for threats is always the first step, the first principle. But what if the position doesn't offer any move that creates a direct threat? How do you decide what to play? That's exactly where the second principle of this video comes in. The idea is to identify which of your pieces is the worst placed, the one with the least activity or the one stuck on a bad square. When there are no immediate attacking moves available, your thinking shifts. You start thinking more strategically, repositioning your pieces so that, little by little, tactical chances and attacking opportunities start to appear naturally. So, looking at this position, which piece is the least active? What do you think? Take a look at each one of your pieces and ask yourself which of them needs a better square to really function in this position. If you quickly scan through your pieces, one of them stands out for the wrong reasons. It does have some influence over the center, but in a very passive way. The bishop on g7 does a good job controlling the e5 square. The rook on d7 has an important role here, controlling the semi-open file. The rook on h8 hasn't really joined the game yet, but it can support pawn pushes later on. And the bishop on e6 keeps an eye on key central squares. Well, the real problem is the knight on e7, which is sitting on a terrible square. Knights, by nature, need to be centralized to really work well, attacking and controlling important squares around them. Stuck on the second rank, its reach drops dramatically and it almost ends up with no real role in the position. So what should black do? Bring that knight toward the center. In general, once a knight reaches the third rank, it already starts to have real activity, right? And from there, it can move deeper into the opponent's territory. And knights really thrive in two situations: strong outposts and squares where they can start creating fork threats. So I played knight to c6, which is the strongest move in the position, because now the knight becomes much more active and can head toward d4. That square is what we call a hole, basically an outpost on a weak square in the opponent's camp, a square that the opponent's pawns can no longer defend. When a knight gets established on a square like that, it dominates everything around it, and it's extremely hard to kick it out, which makes that knight incredibly powerful in that part of the board. And d4 isn't the only option. I mean, there's also the possibility of jumping to b4 as an alternative. Notice how many more active squares and attacking chances the knight has now after this simple maneuver. My opponent responded with pawn to a5, preparing to push a6. From this point on, notice that every move follows the same two principles. The thinking always starts the same way. Is there any move that creates a concrete threat against the opponent's position? Any move that attacks a piece, threatens mate, or forces the opponent to react right away? The first move that really jumps up is knight to b4. From there, the knight puts pressure on the pawn on d3, which is a backward pawn sitting on a semi-open file, with no way for other pawns to defend it. This kind of weakness is one of the most serious in chess, because the pawn can't advance and ends up becoming a fixed target for the rest of the game, something you can keep putting pressure on indefinitely without the opponent ever really solving the problem. That's why I played knight to b4, because besides attacking the pawn on d3, it also stops the pawn from advancing to a6, which was my opponent's main idea. So you can see how this fits perfectly into that battle for the initiative. In chess, the initiative is exactly that. It's the side dictating the direction of the game, creating threats and forcing the opponent to respond. The player with the initiative is the one controlling the action, deciding where the pressure is applied. And the only way you get that initiative is by finding attacking moves, moves that create concrete threats. And to keep the initiative, you have to keep looking for that kind of move without giving your opponent time to reorganize. So I played knight to b4, and my opponent replied with rook to c3, defending the pawn on d3 that was under pressure. Notice that from this moment on, he has to play very defensively, because his pieces are reacting to my moves instead of creating threats of their own, while I keep pressing and dictating the pace of the game. And then that question comes up again, the one you should always be asking yourself when you have the initiative. Can I increase the pressure even more in this position? Is there a way to create another threat and force my opponent to keep responding to my moves? So I keep improving my position move by move, but always with that mindset of forcing the opponent to react, because while he's busy defending, he can't organize any kind of counterplay. So in this position, I played rook to d8, improving the rook and at the same time threatening to take the pawn on d3 with the knight and win material. My opponent replied with rook to a3, and now I want you to try to apply the two principles we've been talking about here. Is there an attacking move in this position? That's the first kind of move we always look for. The knight can go to a2, attacking the rook on c3, so that's already one option. But you can't take the pawn on d3 yet because you have 3 pieces attacking it, and he also has 3 pieces defending it. And f3 has that issue where you're basically just taking the pawn, so the position isn't completely clear. So what do I do now? Is there a way to attack? That's when you go back to that fundamental principle. If there's no attacking move, no move that creates an immediate threat, then you look for your worst piece, the piece that isn't very active and isn't really participating in the game. If we look at the position carefully, the knight on b4 is very well placed, putting direct pressure on the weak pawn on d3. And the doubled rooks on the open file are already placed as well as they can be, so those pieces really can't improve any further. The bishop on e6 also doesn't have a clear square to move to, but the bishop on g7 is clearly the worst placed piece, restricted by its own pawn on e5, and that's a piece we can actually reposition. So with that in mind, I played bishop to f8, which is a very strong move in this position. Even though the bishop goes back to its original square, we've already brought the rook to the center, so the bishop becomes much more active on f8, where it can create tactical threats like knight takes the pawn on d3. Notice how now all the pieces are working in harmony, supporting each other, and that's exactly what you should be aiming for during a game, pieces that are well placed and working together toward the same goal. And the opponent is in a really uncomfortable spot because there's simply no efficient way to deal with the threat of knight takes d3. Even if he tries something like king to f1, which at first glance seems to solve the problem, the truth is the threat of knight takes d3 is still right there. The reason is simple. If he takes on d3 with the bishop, I've got bishop takes a3, and after that capture, the bishop on d3 is completely undefended, which leaves me up the exchange and with a really significant material advantage. And if he prefers to take on d3 with the rook, I can just go bishop takes a3, and once again, there's no way out of this situation. And that's exactly the problem that came up when I brought the bishop back to f8. because the opponent is stuck in a dilemma where any capture leads to losing material. If he takes with the rook, knight d2 is coming, and if he takes with the bishop, the rook on d3 is hanging, which means there's simply no real defense against this threat. Knight takes d3 is going to happen no matter what, regardless of what he chooses, and that's why my opponent ended up playing knight to c4, which was the only move he found to keep fighting in the game. And now I can go bishop takes c4, which is a piece capture and therefore a forcing move, falling right into that first type of move that we're always going to look for whenever possible. If he takes with the pawn, he's getting hit with rook d2, which attacks the bishop on e2 and the bishop on b2 at the same time, creating a double threat that's impossible to deal with. Another possibility would be rook d1, which also works in this position, because he can't take the rook, otherwise he gets back rank mated, so he'd have to play bishop to f1. But now I've got rook to b1 attacking the bishop and threatening to double up on the 8th rank with a checkmate theme as well. So he can't take with the pawn, he's forced to take with the rook. And now the d3 pawn finally falls. I play knight takes d3, and after all the trades on d3, I'm left threatening checkmate on d1. So now I've got a clean extra pawn, and I'm going to work that advantage in the endgame. So notice how all of my decisions throughout this game were based on two fundamental principles that guide your thinking on the board. The first one is to always check for threats. Always see if you have any way to attack your opponent, whether it's with moves that threaten checkmate, moves that give check, or moves that capture a piece. The reason why this type of move is what you're going to consider first in your analysis is that these are the most forcing moves and the ones that demand an immediate response from your opponent, which drastically limits the options he has available. And if none of those threats worked, if you've looked at everything and nothing gives you a concrete result, then you move on to the second principle, which is trying to identify your worst piece and looking to improve that piece so that all of your pieces are working in harmony. That way, you keep improving your position little by little, nice and steady, until the threats and attacks that are going to decide the game in your favor naturally come up. Now you know the two principles. Look for concrete threats first, and when there aren't any, improve your worst piece. But there's a hidden mistake that's costing you some of your wins, and it shows up right in the middle game when you release the tension too early. You build up all that pressure, improve your pieces, create threats, and then you trade pawns or open up the position at the wrong moment. Click on the video that's popping up on screen right now, because in that video, I'm going to show you exactly how to exploit opponents who release the tension first and how this simple positional concept transforms your middle game right away. Click now, because if you stop here, you already know how this story ends. If you enjoyed and learned something new, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.